Yeah, shall I maybe take a little bit look you either in the eye? Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Oxford Martin School and our panel event today on African futures, navigating a profound transition. We are very grateful that both Winnie and Carlos have agreed to take the panel here today in the context of what I consider to be in Oxford currently a very live conversation, in part reflected by a long tradition of scholarship research related to Africa, but also against the backdrop of a recent initiative, the Africa Oxford Strategy Initiative, which has brought together academics and students and partners from the continent also to reflect on the role of a university such as Oxford in relation to a continent in its full diversity, such as that which we refer to as Africa here. The discussion today is in part also meant to bring two people to our universe here of thinking and working who have an extraordinary array of experience, expertise, and first-hand knowledge of the continent. But as I said to both of them, they are here both as Africans who can speak with not only authority, but also great passion about the continent, but they also speak with global context. Both of them have remarkable careers that they lead, and I will in a moment just cover a couple of highlights from both of your lives. And obviously we want you as an audience to engage and see if our conversation about African futures can take us a little closer to moving beyond the horizon of today's news and yesterday's memories or preconceptions or biases in the way that we often are tempted to describe a continent that only exists as a geographical delineation in unitary terms, but otherwise is a continent of extraordinary diversity. Let me briefly introduce our panelists tonight. Winnie Byanyima, who sits to my left, is the Executive Director of Oxfam International. She was born in Uganda and also has a very interesting history that I was surprised to read, that she has a BSc in aeronautical engineering and then later in mechanical engineering. Spent time in the Ugandan parliament, has been at the forefront of women and gender issues and the movement both in Africa and globally, and founded also a civil society organization, the Forum for Women in Democracy, FOWODE, is that pronounced right? She served also in her professional capacity at the African Union Commission, Director of Gender and Development at the United Nations Development Programme, and since 2013 is the Director of Oxfam International. Winnie, thank you very much for being here with us. I will just introduce Carlos and then I'll hand over to both of you. Carlos Lopez is known to many across the continent of Africa, most recently in his capacity as being the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which he led for the past almost 5 years. And before that, spent many years in different capacities across the United Nations system, often being really somebody who wasn't quite your regular United Nations official, because he remained throughout this period intellectually engaged with the world of political debate. He also led at one point the United Nations Staff Training College, into which much of the, let's say, in-service teaching and renewal effort for United Nations officials takes place. He was elected to the Lisbon Academy of Sciences in Portugal. He is the author of many books and has also taught at academic institutions from Lisbon, Coimbra, Zurich, Uppsala, Mexico, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro, and is now currently both a visiting fellow here at the Oxford Martin School, but also holds a visiting professorship at the Faculty of Commerce of the Graduate School of Development and Policy Practice at the University of Cape Town, And as he will no doubt mention also in his work, is currently engaged also in the African Union reform efforts that are being led by, under the leadership of President Paul Kagame. So, ladies and gentlemen, two extraordinary people on the podium, and I have invited both of them to take about 5 to 7 minutes to, in a sense, lay out a vision of African futures. What could it mean looking over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years? And then in a few key areas, we will try and probe a little deeper, and I will also turn to you as an audience for questions. Please be aware this event is being live webcast and will also be then on the website available as a recorded product. I think with these opening remarks, Winnie, may I turn to you? You have the floor. African Futures.
Thank you, Ashim, and thank you for inviting me to the Oxford Martin School. I'm from Oxfam. We are an organization. We like to see ourselves as a movement, part of a movement that fights the injustice of poverty. We're based here because we were founded here, and our work is global. We work in more than 95 countries and 36 countries in Africa. I want to be an Afro-optimist. And so thinking about the future, I think of a bright future for Africa. And where are we starting? And I have to be optimistic. And what makes me optimistic is when I travel across Africa, it's the young people of Africa that I meet. You know, they're there taking risks, finding ways to create jobs for themselves, using technology, using everything available to them. They inspire me. So I'm going to look to the future in an optimistic way. My starting point is, what do we have? What do we have in Africa that can set us on a path to a prosperous future for our people, for all our people? Well, I think first of all about this young generation that is the best educated generation we have. That in 2025, half of our people will be below the age of 25, but for the first time, they'll be well educated, more educated than ever before. That's our greatest natural resource. That's our starting point. Then you can think of our other natural resources. Africa that has 1/3 of all the mineral resource in the world. I could talk about the renewable sources of energy that we have. Today, did you know that South Africa is one of the 10 top innovators in solar energy? Because we have it in greatest abundance, and we are innovating in that space. We have geothermal energy. So we're rich in natural resources, both the mineral resources, the energy resource. And then thirdly, politically, you know, this is difficult to say because when you say politically, everybody thinks of Africa in conflict, Africa in wars, and now famines, 3 famines in Africa today, frightening. But yet, when you think about what we have politically as Africans, we are the one continent that shares a common history and a strong sense of common destiny. We are people who are bound together by our history and who share this vision of our connected future. So we are the region with the most elaborate framework of norms, of standards, more than any other region. We go to the world with one voice, more than any other region. This is in our favor. We have, for example, our African Charter of Human and People's Rights. This is a strong framework that is additional to the human rights framework, the universal one. It speaks about the individual rights and speaks also about the collective rights that are missing in the Universal Human Rights Instrument. We have our own protocol on African women's rights that's additional to the CEDAW Convention of the United Nations, and so on. So this common destiny that makes us shape our own norms and come to the world with one voice is powerful for us. So with our people, our young generation, well-educated, with our resources, natural resources, and with this shared history and framework and voice, we should be poised to move to a prosperous future. But then, 3 things I think we need to work on to get there. One is about the global rules. The global rules don't work for Africa. The global rules were not set by Africa and are not being set by Africa and work against us. I'll take one example, the tax rules. The tax rules, Africa loses, think about this, $100 billion, no, 100 billion is for the developing countries. Of this, $38 billion is lost to Africa through one particular loophole of tax havens. Just one out of so many loopholes in the tax system that Africa loses revenue. That's one. Then think about this. 1/3 of our rich Africans have $500 billion of their wealth offshore, untaxed. If it were taxed, it would give us $14 billion annually. That's the amount of money that could save the lives of 4 million children by paying their health care bills, and also pay all the teachers we need to keep all African children in school. Think about that. And that's just one tax loophole. If these loopholes could be plugged by having a global corporate tax reform, think of the resources that would be available for African development. So, but there is resistance. Some reform has been done, led by the OECD, the Club of Rich Countries. They have led some reforms, but guess what? These reforms, called base erosion and profit shifting, BEPS, have benefited themselves, the rich countries. Africa and the other developing countries who were not in this process continue to bleed and are not beneficiary to these tax reforms. We need a global corporate. I could go on about climate justice, the money for climate adaptation being so little compared to the money for climate mitigation. Mitigation is rich countries turning their technology and protecting themselves. Adaptation is the money that the poor countries who didn't cause climate change need to adapt to a changing climate. That's not there. It's only 16% of the total funds that go for adaptation. These are the rules that don't work for Africa. So Africa needs to get its act together to insist on global rules that work for it. We haven't done a good job there. But unless we do, whether it's trade rules, investment rules, climate rules, trade rules, tax rules, we are not going to make headway. We've got to engage the global system together with other developing countries and get a fair deal. Second, strategic investments. Africa is looking for resources for infrastructure. Great. To connect our countries, to build a market, to transport goods and whatever. Fantastic. But I want to focus on investments where the people are and in the people themselves. 50% of our people earn their livelihoods, incomes from agriculture. Unless we put resources there and turn that agriculture to be more productive and to give real incomes to people, that's our starting point, we won't make headway. And of course in education and health. And lastly, the third thing is the governance. And it's going to be my last point. I'm impatient. If we don't have legitimate and competent governance, we will not get there to that 30 years from now, a prosperous Africa. For me, illegitimate governments are also incompetent governments. Unless you can subject yourselves to competition, you cannot deliver efficiently, effectively, and for all. So the crisis of legitimacy is a big one for us in Africa. And this also leads to political capture and rising inequality. We have conflict, but even where we have stable politics, we have political capture where growth is just being captured by a few. So we need to tackle this crisis of legitimacy and have really accountable and competent governance in order to get there. So those are my first shots.
Thank you very much, Winnie. And I think 3 key areas that you describe as conditional, but also central to that vision that you laid out. So, Carlos, let's turn to you. Africa, 30 years down the line. You probably share a lot of the description that Winnie just gave. Would you arrive at the same kind of strategic agenda where change is likely to play out? Or how would you describe key areas in which that African future scenario plays out?
Well, I like to, when a question like this is posed, I like to travel to Japan to talk about Africa. And the reason has to do with demographics. So imagine a country where every year there is a day that celebrates those who have attained at least 100 years. And in Japan this year, that number attained about 61,000. And imagine that this progression of the number of people that are 100 years or older is going to keep increasing to the point that by 2050, in Japan, most likely can be close to 1 million. And imagine that that country is also the country with the highest debt to GDP ratio, which is now over 200%. And imagine how is this country going to pay its debt, with people that are aging so fast. And Japan may be an extreme case, but in fact in Europe, in 2065, 65% of the population is going to be over 65. So how is this going to play? And then we start to understand that Africa is part of the global solution. Because right now, the average age in Africa is so low that about 22 countries have an average age of about 20 years old. And this is going to be even more extreme because the number of people that are basically going to be in the bracket that we consider young, up to 35, it's going to start concentrating more and more geographically in a continent that we call Africa. As a result of this demographic tectonic shift, we are going to face a situation where all discussions that we have had for a very long time, in fact, we can trace these discussions to the social contract written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which was 250 plus years ago, on intergenerational solidarity, are going to have to take place in a context where when we talk about children, meaning the young people, we are talking about people that are in one particular geographical area, Africa, because the rest of the population will be aging fast. So are we ready for the consequences of such an incredible demographic shift? Because, it starts with right now, refugees discussion, migration, human mobility, but it's just going to cascade into something much bigger that has a lot of implications in the way we look into how we organize labor, how we deal with economics, how we measure productivity, and so on and so forth. So we are talking about something that is really nuclear in terms of its consequences. Just think about the urban dimension. Africa moves 24 million people a year into urban areas right now. I mean, if you want to compare with the closest phenomena of this kind, it was China, it's about 11 million. So are we going to organize this incredible shift of population into urban life, which is the fastest ever in human history? And this is going to happen so quick that in just about 20, 30 years, the majority of the population, of course, is already either urban or close to be. It's going to occupy the majority of social and economic life in the continent. So I think we are not ready really to understand that some of the dynamics that are taking place in Africa, and I'm just referring to the demographic ones, I'm going to come to the others, are going to have global implications. And we cannot isolate the discussion about Africa as if it was something that doesn't concern the rest of the world. Obviously, if you look into how Africa has behaved economically over the last, say, decade and a half, there is a lot of positives that we can signal, and that has given space for the Africa Rising narrative, which is a very misleading narrative. Not because I'm not an Afro-optimist, I am, like Winnie, but because it's not about the way it has been described, which is opportunities exist in Africa for business to actually expand. And in so doing, we were looking into the very traditional ways of expanding markets, which is, how we take advantage of the minerals, the extractives, and the commodities of the continent in a better way. Well, that's very good. Thank you very much. But it doesn't change structurally the characteristics of African economies. And if we want really to move into deep structural transformation of the economies of the continent, we have to be not espousing the African rising narrative, but rather deeply understanding context, which normally is what is missing when we talk about the continent. I'll give you some examples. Typically, people will say, can we really trust numbers about Africa, like GDP numbers? And the answer is no, you should not. Because, in fact, just take national accounts, have certain number of methodological standards that everybody's supposed to follow. There are only 12 African countries that are really up to date with the methodological requirements that are recommended for national accounts, which, amongst others, require that the base year that we use is not beyond 5. Some countries have updated their accounts recently through rebasing exercises. You have heard, for instance, of Nigeria becoming the largest economy of the continent thanks to such an exercise. But the reality still remains that only 12 countries in the continent is not enough for us to know exactly the characteristics and the structures of the economies, let alone their size. Which means that what we know is the size of the continent, economically speaking, is highly underestimated. Because normally for every year that you are late, in terms of your national accounts, it means that you probably are missing something. And I'm not joking because, Eurostat, which is a very solid, reputable statistical agency, has requested Italy to update their national accounts 2 years ago. They did it, and they increased their GDP slightly because they started accounting for mafia and prostitution activities. So this is a very clear example that we are talking about things that are very difficult to measure, and most of African economies, as we know, are tainted by informal characteristics, and therefore, not following the latest methodological standards has their consequences for the knowledge that we have about economic activity. If we were to have good statistics in the continent, not just on national accounts, but also on census, population, you know that civil registration is a big problem in Africa. Only about 25% of Africans have a birth certificate. You would be probably realizing how big is this underestimation. And with this underestimation comes also lack of knowledge about context, lack of knowledge about the requirements that are, implicit in any planning strategy that you want to have. But I can go on with, this issue of underestimations because of its importance for us to realize what is possible and not possible in the continent, and because we are so full of misperceptions about the continent, and these misperceptions typically are negative. And how we turn that page is extremely important, and we can talk more about it in the debate if people are interested. My last point is about technology, because there is a huge number of authors that are now focusing on the impact of automation, robotization, and basically technological developments on the labor future. And of course, how does this affect the continent that by 2034 is going to have the largest number of people in working age, so surpassing India and China. And normally what people believe is that, there will be no more jobs, at least stable jobs, formal jobs, industrial jobs, to be acquired by a latecomer like Africa tends to be. Not entirely. I will immediately correct that misperception when we talk a bit more about industrialization and the possibilities in the continent, that I know is one of the issues that Akim wants us to cover. But in general, people don't realize that in the last 15 years, about 10% of Africa's growth can be attributed to technological contributions. In fact, it is technology that is driving part of Africa's growth right now. And just the phenomena of mobile telephony has contributed immensely for value addition in the African economies. So much so that 2/3 of Africa's growth has been promoted or provoked by types of consumption, rising middle class. It's about 2/3 of the growth comes from internal consumption associated with technological developments, including mobile telephony in particular. So we tend to see technology just as a disruptor, which it will be. I can elaborate on that. But we don't see also technology as a contributor for some of the changes that are going in the right direction right now, because we amalgamate, frugal innovation, we amalgamate technological democratization and access with, sophisticated forms of measuring productivity in the global value chains. And I think when we understand these different contextual issues that I just mentioned, the demographic one, how the economies are evolving and how much underestimation there is, and technological developments that can favor Africa if properly taken into account in our analysis and with its proper context, we can really see an Africa that should be discussed, not in terms of whether it has a future, but in terms that it is part of everybody's future.
Carlos, can I pick up straight at where you left off? I mean, if you were to look at the image you have of Africa 25, 30 years down the line, or that many people would have, usually development is associated with roads, power stations, cities, chimneys, manufacturing, industrialization. You already alluded to the fact that Africa is a latecomer and labor as an advantage is increasingly being eroded with automation, digital technologies. So the East Asian tiger story, for instance, as an analogy, may not quite work for Africa. So, and now we have to sort of do it in 2 or 3 minute chunks. If I could ask you, how do you see the prospect for Africa to accelerate its development through industrialization, as opposed to or alongside that view of the rural economy also being a significant part of Africa in 2050, for example?
Well, a couple of facts before I address your question. First, we know that between 60 and 70%, according to different measurements, of the Africa's population still depends on the primary sector. But the contribution of the primary sector, agriculture in particular, to Africa's combined GDP, it's now about 8 to 10% only. And you have less people in the services and manufacturing, etc. But in fact, the size of the industrial sector in Africa is larger than agriculture in GDP terms. And the size of services is immensely bigger. So in that, Africa is not very different from the trends that you see elsewhere in the world. But it's not the way we associate, because the majority of the population still is in the rural areas, or depend on the rural areas. Why? Because, the productivity of the agricultural and primary sector is very low, the yields per hectare are very low, there is drought, there is problems of food security. There's a huge catalog of problems that basically explain that situation. But the bottom line, for me, is that the pull factor that industrialization has played in every other region of the world to increase agricultural productivity is not yet completely present in the continent. So it is industrialization that is going to bring the structural changes that are necessary in agriculture. And that is very important for us to mention, because people associate industrialization with factories. Industrialization is about productive systems. It's how you make sure that you modernize your productive systems, even if you don't have one single factory. And if we don't do that transformation, we are basically with levels of productivity that are extremely low. So that's just for facts. Now, a latecomer into industrialization cannot do import substitution model that Latin America indulged in in the 70s. Neither can we repeat the miracle of Southeast Asia and China in particular of export-oriented industrialization. Those niches are gone. Global value chains have become very complex. Intellectual property is now completely fragmented and not dominated by countries. You have difficulties of accessing capital that others didn't have. You have trade regimes that are extremely open. At the time that others did their industrial transformation, they had a lot of protection that is no longer available. And we can go on with the catalog of difficulties. So how can Africa really, under these circumstances, mostly a latecomer, I continue to say mostly, maybe I should reveal why, is because Africa right now exports $500 billion worth of manufactured goods, and nobody talks about it. It's 500 billion. It's not small, it's more than India. But people don't mention. But still, it's a latecomer to a large extent. And I think it is very important for us to realize that you can only make it if you master the global value chains, entry points extremely well. And therefore, for me, there are three things that are in favor of the latecomer. One, Winnie mentioned it, is the fact that we have incredible renewable energy potential. So we can leapfrog into a green industrialization platform, whether others have to retrofit, they have to mitigate, they have to do a number of things. Africa can just jump into the latest square and be in the corner where things have become very efficient, in terms of prices, very competitive, and so on. There is no reason for us to go the high carbon footprint. And that's an incredible advantage. The second is the African market. I just mentioned to you all these numbers about how big we are going to be, 2 billion. Well, imagine just small transformation on agro-processing, You know, my example is yogurt. You know, Africa imports 63% of the yogurt it consumes. Yogurt? Yogurt? I mean, is this rocket science? Now imagine the potential of middle class rising, consuming transformed foods and all other types of consumer habits that will be associated with the middle class. Incredible potential for agro-processing. And, you know, you don't need to look into import substitution in the traditional way. You just need to expand the regional markets to absorb this incredible demand that is going to be there. And honestly, you are not going to have robots producing yogurt. This is the point that I want to stress also. Because when you talk about automation, robotization, that is for levels of productivity that are so high that concern segments of the industry, not everything. And we are amalgamating as if everything is going to disappear. It's going to affect much more services than it's going to affect manufacturing, actually. And then finally, so I mentioned this dimension of first, renewable and no need for retrofitting, leapfrogging. Second, the regional market dimension that is extremely important. And the third is the technology. Believe it or not, frugal innovation in Africa is responsible for a number of the growth areas that we have right now. And I think we have to invest much more on those. And that is going to create a different type of industry that we are seeing happening. I'm just going to give you one example, if you allow me, very briefly, which is the Awassa Industrial Park in Ethiopia. Awassa is a small town south of Ethiopia. They create an industrial park that is going to produce textiles, apparel, and basically they are trying to compete with Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and a number of producers in Asia. And before the industrial park was finished, everything was rented out to investors from abroad. Most of those investors came from the countries where the competition is. So you have Bangladeshi investors, you have Sri Lankan investors, you have a number of basically suppliers of big chains that thought it was interesting to move part of their production into Ethiopia. Why? And the why is very interesting because very telling about the future and the potential of industrialization in the continent. The why is because in the current state of public discussion, there is concern about environmental standards and labor standards. And everybody doesn't want anymore to buy a t-shirt that is not produced respecting a certain number of labor and environmental standards. So the Ethiopians studied this niche and offered to these producers the standards that are the highest from afresh. And for them, it's cheaper to move the production there than retrofitting where they are producing right now to meet those standards. And the standards are like the distance from toilets for each worker, how much natural light gets into the plant, are the waters recycled and stuff like that. Very, very concrete. And they did this, and I'm mentioning, this is not a small project. Awassa Industrial Park is going to produce $1 billion of textiles. And the production is starting this year, and everything is according to schedule so far. So we are not talking about a small micro experiment. And I think lessons are there for, responding to your questions.
Thank you, Carlos. Winnie, do you recognize that economy on, let's say, the radar with which you currently observe an African continent that actually, interesting enough, to take your point, with 1 billion people, over 600 million actually sustain themselves in that rural economy today? Obviously at a low level of income and, sometimes affected in extreme forms by droughts and floods, but nevertheless, that is a number of people far larger than the European Union today encompasses. But does that rural economy hold promise for you? How does it relate to issues such as land, We talked about pastoralism before we walked into the conference room here today, and opportunity to leverage both the human resource, this extraordinary number of young people, but also the ecological, the natural resource base that is there without diminishing it over a generation and therefore destroying it.
Carlos talked about the rapid urbanization in Africa. And when you ask about the rural economy, I see a strong connection there between the rural economy and the growth of these urban centers in Africa. We have an opportunity where agriculture, where most people are in Africa, are getting their income, could actually feed these huge cities that are growing in Africa. The opportunities are there. But then we also talked, Carlos talked a lot about industrialization and the opportunity for Africa to industrialize and generate growth through industrialization. For me, as Carlos was describing the various problems that we face, what I was hearing is really a system, an economic system that has grown, that has matured, that has reached its peak, and that doesn't work anymore. So for me, the starting point is that we are stuck in a neoliberal economic model that doesn't give Africa a chance. You keep talking about Africa's the late starters, starting later, our opportunity in this global economy. Unless we unrig it, we haven't a chance. Why do I say that? You have an economic model where those with capital have an edge over everybody else. So it's an economic model that keeps giving profits to shareholders, workers, suppliers. Africa, we have our natural resource. Our natural resource itself, plus our energy, should give us that opportunity to, if we were in a fair economic system, to be able to use that to propel ourselves. But no, we have an economic model that advantages those with capital, with the technology, and that trashes workers, keeps them at the bottom, especially if they are women, that does not pay suppliers, like smallholder farmers, they are fair, pay for what they work for, but that keeps turning profits for those who started earlier with the capital. So unless we can unrig that, I really don't see us getting Africa there where we want it. We are stuck in a rigged economic model. So we must change the business models. We must change also the way economies are run. There are huge opportunities. We are fighting climate change. We need to change the way agriculture is done. We need to protect our rivers. We need to protect our air. We need to clean up our air. All these are opportunities, create jobs, good jobs for young Africans. But that can't happen when the companies that come to take the opportunity, the rules of the game are that you can destroy the environment, you can underpay people, you can treat women badly and make your profit, and it's all okay. So for me, it lies in changing the economic model, the way we count, the way we measure growth and progress at the national level, and also the business models of companies. Companies must do business. It must stop being acceptable to drive profits in that kind of way. So for me, my what I see as opportunity is this angry middle-class population out here in the north. you who voted for Brexit and those who voted Trump, the anger of those left behind, the middle classes that are left behind in the North, for me, are crying out for a change in the economic model, a change in business models, and unless we can connect our voices with them and demand for these changes, we are not going to see Africa breaking through. Rural or urban, the opportunity for creating good lives for everybody are held back by the rules that were framed 30, 40 years ago of how economies are run and how business is done that are really unfair. But we have come to accept them. And we keep trying to work through them and to organize and to break through them. No, we won't. No, we won't.
Well, it raises a question. Can Africa afford to challenge them, or can Africa succeed in challenging them? And you just made an interesting connection. Maybe there are new alliances that might be formed that would drive that change.
Absolutely. I'm all the time now tweeting with all the people who are angry in the North, because if they are going to vote Le Pen or whoever because they are angry at the failure of growth to deliver to everybody, workers' wages to remain stagnant as people at the top keep paying themselves more and more, that's the same with us in Africa. We see big companies coming to invest, to take out the gold, to take out the diamonds, while people's lives don't improve. Instead, their water gets polluted, their air is polluted, they have no jobs. So we can be in alliances for change. We want growth, but growth that benefits everybody. And that's to do with economic management, that's to do with business models. So there are opportunities now for fighting together. There are too many who are left behind, even in these rich countries.
Let me turn for a moment to you as our audience. Would you like to offer a comment, challenge our panelists? Don't be too shy, they are tough people. They can take it, or agree with them. Yes, can I take the first hand there? Can you just raise your hands again? I saw a few more. Yes, David, and one more at the back there. Okay, yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to ask what your prognosis is for the security issue, insecurity, containing conflict wherever it erupts, and what is at present the very complex and costly business of stabilization. What sort of impact do you think that will have on the futures that you've already described?
Right. David, here, please. We'll take a few questions and then I'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond, please.
Thank you. Winnie began by telling us three special things about Africa, and Carlos built powerfully on that. I suppose inevitably each of us will now want to exercise our particular hobby horses, so let me take mine out for a canter. Something that's very special about Africa, if not unique, is its environment, its biodiversity, particularly its megafauna. In your visions for the future of the continent, is there a special place for that very special aspect of Africa?
Thank you. Do I have, yes, another hand here?
I'm just slightly worried if we are putting our future into the alliances with extremism and hoping that this is going to bring change that we want.
Okay, Carlos, maybe, and then we'll take another round.
Well, I'll leave the extremists to Winnie. Well, on security, I think, again, like in many areas concerning Africa, there is first a need to bring a bit of context to fight misperceptions. I'm not saying that it is yours, but just in general, like for instance, the number of people affected by conflict in the continent is not exactly what we think it is. Yes, it is true that about 100 million Africans are affected by conflict one way or another. But we forget about the other 900 million that are not. And also, if we just compare with other regions of the world, Asia has much more people affected by conflict than Africa. If you take Boko Haram out of West Africa, just to give you an idea, and I'm singling out Boko Haram because I'm going to talk about it for reasons that you will understand. If you just take Boko Haram out of West Africa, the number of people killed by conflict in Africa is less than the number of people killed by conflict in Southeast Asia. So this to mention that in fact conflicts in Africa are evolving in nature, and the majority of the conflicts are now associated with forms of terrorism, like the ones practiced by Boko Haram, that is by far the most murdered terrorist organization on earth right now, not just on Africa, on earth. And it inflates considerably the figures of people affected by conflict. Other conflicts are not exactly the dimension we believe they have. Just to give you an example, are more people affected by conflict in India than there are in the Great Lakes area of Africa. But that's not the perception we have. And the reason is because African conflicts are all in the eye of the storm. African conflicts are part of the agenda of the Security Council. Asian conflicts are not mostly part of the Security Council agenda because China would not allow other reasons of geostrategic nature. So you wouldn't know as much about those conflicts and will not be as much publicized in the public opinion as the conflicts in Africa. So that's just contextual. Now, conflicts are really costing Africa extremely important, economic consequences for two reasons. First, perceptions of risk. So you have typically investors will not come to Africa because there is immediately a perception that the conflict is at war or has problems of conflict management and so on and so forth. So the risk perception is really very, very costly. And the second dimension is the human suffering, because conflicts are an impediment for economic transformation. So a lot of the most ambitious programs that some African countries have designed and have the ambition for get stuck because of conflicts. And at the roots of those conflicts, I think there is one common thread in all African conflicts, which is lack of respect for diversity. And this is not the idea that we Africans want normally to associate with ourselves, that there is a lack of tolerance to diversity, but there is. And most of the conflicts are deriving from that lack of tolerance to, the other. And this is particularly true when you look into the way elections and the management of modern forms of governance are being managed. And in most cases, they are not producing this respect for diversity that is required for us to have more stability and create the economic conditions that we require. So for me, economic transformation in Africa has a lot of impediments. Winnie, for instance, was mentioning some that are international, that are extremely brutal to the continent, like, for instance, the illicit financial flows. But you have also, in the political sphere and the conflict sphere, amazing impediments for economic transformation. So that would be my take on that. And then on the issue of wildlife and in general, how we protect our environment, I think Africans have given a lesson to the world that they are more capable of preserving their environment than any other region. And I think we need more knowledge of what made that possible. Partly, people would say simplistically, that is lack of development or lack of growth that is responsible for it. I would like to argue that it is a much more comprehensive view. But the more we become hostage to a rent-seeking behavior on the part of government structures, the more, the environment will be threatened. The two go together. If you have a rent-seeking attitude, it means basically you don't care much about public goods. And if you don't worried about public goods, everything goes into the trap, including, your environmental protection. So the more we have governments that are accountable, that are concerned with the public good, the more also you are likely to have the right behavior.
Winnie.
Well, first I must make a clarification. When I say I'm happy with the anger of middle classes voting, who are voting the populist extreme right, I don't mean I support the extreme right. No, I'm just happy at the anger. In my language, we have something we say that the pain is known by the injured finger. That if you have a finger which is injured, that's where the pain is. You don't ask the foot won't feel it. So, in other words, always change comes from those who feel the pain the most. As somebody who's been in a liberation struggle, I know this for sure. People who are feeling left out, if they are mobilized, if they understand where the problem is, they will take the action to cause the change. So it's so important that those of us who feel strongly about social justice, economic justice, speak, engage with populations who are angry at being left out, who see growth, who see change that is good in the world, but who are not part of it. We should talk to them and explain to them what is wrong. It's in the rules of the economy, and it should change, and it can change. So that's what I mean about building alliances, progressive alliances, people in the South, people in the North, workers in the North, who are faced with this disruptive technological change that could be in their benefit, that could create jobs for them, good jobs for them, but instead is in the hands of those with capital, and they're taking away their jobs, and they don't care. They just want profits for themselves. So these are the people who want to mobilize to speak the same language and tell them that, you see, us in Africa, we've been squeezed to the wall. Globalization has not been good for us, but we were crying alone. Now that you are feeling the pain too, let's stand in solidarity and challenge the system and get the rules to work for all of us. It's not about Trump and Le Pen. They don't have the answers, but they have been able to take advantage of the pain of ordinary working people for whom the economic model does not work. That was my point. So I am out to mobilize. As somebody who's a mobilizer, I find an opportunity now to remobilize publics to change an economic order that doesn't work. On the question of conflict, I want to agree with Carlos and emphasize that for Africa, for everywhere where there's conflict, but for us in Africa, the real cost is the cost of lives and the cost of the future of our young people. All those young people who are not having an education, who are not having health, who are in a refugee camp, in an IDP, that's the real cost to us. And then the way the changing nature of the conflict, as Carlos has said, more and more of it driven by extremism and terror, you see a particular brutality meted out to women. You see women more on the front lines, being used as weapons of war themselves. Their bodies that are being made an issue on the front line. So there is particular brutality to women in this kind of conflict. What worries me is that the solutions lie within Africa and in the international setting. But in both, the institutions are dysfunctional. The system, the Security Council of the United Nations, totally dysfunctional. Something created from the Second World War that doesn't reflect the realities of today. And not enough ambition to change it. So it doesn't work. African institutions also have a lot of problems that I don't want to discuss here. But there's a lack of institutional frameworks through which we can resolve these conflicts. That is something to work on. You also talked about the environment, the biodiversity of Africa, and in the vision of the future. This is really, it's a huge asset that we have. It's our wealth, but then again, it is not valued in the economic model. It's valueless, the environment. It can be tracked. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals that are trying to bring in a cost to the environment. We are moving towards carbon pricing, which is putting a price on the pollution from carbon. But still, the biodiversity we have, those birds that are just there in front of my garden in my farm in Africa that I take for granted, there's no price on them. A company will come and pollute my village and kill all the birds there and make its profit, and will register growth, and that will go. So there is still a huge challenge of valuing our biodiversity, our environment, and giving and using it as part of our precious resource that can fetch value for us. Value meaning that it's protected and valued, and those and others from other regions can come and enjoy it. We still have a challenge because the frameworks that we have agreed within the global system on sustainable development goals, on biodiversity rules, are not enforced and are overridden by other rules that work for globalization. So there are contradictions in the system.
Can I maybe pick up, are there other questions? I don't want to leave anybody out. Okay, maybe we can take 3 at the back there. Sorry, Caroline, other end. Starting on the right, your right, Caroline, yeah. And then we'll take 2 on the left.
Thanks for the interesting discussions. I just wanted to have sort of 2 points to ask. First of all, about capitalism in Africa, because capitalism will never get enough. So it's basically a system, as far as I understand, that will just go around the world getting resources at any cost, because it's just built into the system that they can always sell it off at a profit. And what you're talking about, it's tied into biodiversity and the environment. So I just wanted you guys to comment on that if you don't mind. And also the second point is, I'm a little bit sensitive when people always refer to Africa as Africa, because it's not a monolith. North is very different from South, and West is very different from East. And like I have heard several times, I can see the logic behind it, but I see you comparing Africa to India or China. And it's something I take issue with, because it sort of blands out the whole continent as one story, and there are lots of stories going on in that, on the continent. And I just want you, again, to please address that.
And across the aisle, yeah.
Thank you very much for those really fascinating talks. I wanted to pick up Winnie's point about workers, and particularly the women workers, the fact that women workers are exploited and the absence of decent standards of work on the ILO decent work program. And I was wondering what both of you think about where you start, how you get to a position of achieving better standards for women in different African countries, particularly in relation to education, access to schools, and the relation between unpaid caring work and paid work in the market. Thank you.
There was one more hand up, I think you wrote. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. It's been touched on indirectly in several ways, but I wanted to ask directly the panel's view on corruption and whether you see recent trends in one particular direction, or whether you see a gap where there must be change to and a movement to, against that in the future.
Can I take a last, maybe two questions here, and then I'll give the panel a chance to respond. Go ahead.
A quick question. What do you think about the way we are educating these young people who will be the backbone of economies both in Africa and abroad in the next 20, 50 years? Are we preparing them well enough to take on that challenge? Is education in any way in the continent changing to address those future problems? And number two, I don't know how well we are having a conversation about African futures without reckoning with African past. Is there any place for us to actually have an honest conversation about the African past before we can actually think of how we're going to deal with the future?
Yes.
I'm going to take it. The political tide in Europe and the US seems to be turning very markedly against development aid. Is that going to make any difference to your visions for the future?
Right, Carlos, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. Let me start with this issue, whether we should talk about Africa as one and compare it with the likes of China and India. Of course, you know, some people feel very emotionally about this, and so I respect your point of view, but we used to be compared with Belgium, so this is an improvement. And I think if you think of China and India as having populations that are bigger than Africa, the only ones that have so, that's where the comparator becomes interesting. If you apply for a certain types of categories, like for instance size of GDP, I actually like very much to compare with India, because Africa with 54 entities, and we're just talking about the sort of the political entities, not the rest of the diversity that is much larger. But with 54 entities, is supposed to have a level of complexity in decision-making processes that will make it behind India in almost any possible indicator you may think of, because India will have the advantage of having one single political process, even though there is enough diversity within the Indian political system to make decisions. And I think if you think that Africa has a larger GDP than India, has a larger GDP per capita than India, has a larger size of world trade than India, and you go on with some of these indicators, it becomes a favorable comparison to Africa. So I don't see it necessarily from a negative perspective, but rather, you know, from this type of categorization, it makes sense. But of course, it is true that Africa is very diverse. And it is also true that in the majority of cases, you will see statistics produced for sub-Saharan Africa being presented as Africa, which is the case, you know, for Bretton Woods institutions and a lot of UN and other multilateral institutions, which is very irritating. Because, you know, if either it is Africa or it is not Africa, but we shouldn't be in the middle, which is, you know, to characterize as Africa something that is just part of Africa and vice versa. So I think what really makes sense is for us to recognize that it's the only continent, and Winnie alluded to that, it's the only continent that has one single political structure, the African Union. As you know, Europe doesn't. It has the majority, but not all European countries, and it's disintegrating somehow. But now that we have just readmitted Morocco, we are in good shape in terms of that kind of representation. And it is not a coincidence. The debate about Pan-Africanism is very lively. And the ideology, if you want to call it that way, of Pan-Africanism doesn't have an equivalent in any other part of the world. You don't talk about Pan-Europeanism or Pan-anything like you do for Africa, because there is an enshrined history of trying to see the continent as one that comes from the way it was characterized by our diaspora in the 50s. And it was the diaspora that created the concept, and then it was espoused by the OAU and now the AU. I was asked by the African Union leadership to moderate a discussion amongst African heads of state in 2013 about the future of the continent. This is to answer your question about the past. And the exercise was precisely to look into what have we achieved in the last 50 years and what are the things that we did wrong that we don't want to repeat in the next 50. And that's how the Agenda 2063, for those who are familiar, was constructed. It was with an exercise that started with this serious and truthful exchange about the past. And then, from that, try to identify the aspirations that are common to all of us. And you will come out with 7 aspirations, and you can go and visit the websites of the African Union and familiarize yourselves with those if you are interested. And now there is a realization by the same institution and its leaders that the institution itself is not equipped to respond to those 7 aspirations. Although they were agreed, the characteristics of the institution are not really providing the basis for this to happen. And AU Reform Group was established with President Kagame as its leader. I'm one of the 9 members of the group. And then the group characterized the current state of affairs of the African Union with one word that is in the documents officially as dysfunctional. So now we are dealing with the dysfunctional nature of the decision-making process of the institution to try to overcome the problems that have been identified. So this is just to confirm that there is a reflection about the past and not trying to imitate the mistakes of the past. On the issue of capitalism, I prefer to actually link this discussion with the question about development aid, just to give you a feeling of the difference that it does make if we do the right things in terms of mobilizing resources, in terms of using efficiently resources. Development aid for the whole of Africa is in the range of about 42 billion today. If you go back just 15 years, it was in the range of about 48 to 50 billion. So it's slightly eroding. And everybody believes that erosion will continue. I don't think it will be abrupt, but it will continue to erode. So that erosion, how much does it represent in terms of, Africa's needs of resources and transformation? Well, just in terms of taxes collected by Africans themselves, meaning the fiscal capacity of the continent, we are talking about an evolution in the same period, 15 years, from $123 billion of taxes collected to currently about 600 billion. So you see the rise, and you see how much a difference it makes. 48 billion when you have 123 that you collect from your taxes, and 42 billion when you collect 600 billion. And this is just one dimension of it. You have, influx of FDI or foreign direct investment that has increased quite significantly, more than 135% since the year 2000. You have a much more controlled macroeconomic environment, including debt, that in average in Africa, debt to GDP ratio is about 35%, which, you just compared what I said about Japan. But of course, it's not the only way you have to look into that. You have to look into the capacity to pay your service of the same debt, which is much more important, etc. But the bottom line is this: aid is no longer playing the key role it used to play. Therefore, it needs to change. It needs to transform itself into a multiplier that will allow for an increase of domestic resource mobilization. And you can do that in different ways, but we don't have time to go into all of them.
We are running out here.
So I will stop there. Thank you.
Sorry, not to interrupt you, but I
No, but it was my point.
It's my fault. I let it run a little bit longer. We'll wrap up in the next 5 minutes. But Winnie, over to you, and both on the questions that Carlos picked up, but also some of the ones not yet responded to. If you.
Yeah, I'll start with the one on women's rights, and say that it's one of the biggest challenges that we have on the continent. Moving our countries towards greater equality of men and women and creating opportunity for women. And you mentioned education. I think that's where it starts. For one to have an economic opportunity, one needs to first have their human capability developed. And we still have huge gaps. We've closed the gap on primary education, but there's still a huge gap at the secondary level, at the university level, post-secondary level. And this is about valuing the girl child. Both the family, and that's in the social norms, to give opportunity to the child, but also for the governments themselves to give value to the girl child and support the girl child and fight the social norms that discriminate against girls. This is something I could talk about for the whole day and the whole night, tackling the social norms. Because we've made the legal frameworks. They are there at the African level, at the country level. Some of our countries even have quotas for women in politics, and many elaborate frameworks against even culture that discriminates. But we don't go far enough to tackle the informal rules that hold people, that govern relations at the family level in ordinary households. People who live in poverty the rules, the law books don't work for them. What works is the religion, the culture, the tradition. That's what governs their lives, from childhood to marriage to death. And unless that is tackled, and unless governments see it as their role to transform those rules, informal rules that discriminate against girls and women, that make it acceptable to beat a woman, to control her body, to deny her a voice on family decision making when she's the real farmer, but she can't decide how to farm and what to sell and even hurting productivity at the household level, unless those things are seen as responsibility of governments to change, our progress is slow on women's rights and on their rights in the economy, and also on the economic progress of our countries. And I wanted to say something about aid, again, and connect it to the issue of leadership in our countries, in Africa. You see, it's true that aid is shrinking, and so it should, because our countries are also becoming better able to raise their own domestic resources. They're getting richer. So, but then what I don't see amongst our African leaders are leaders who can harness the resources that are there from the emerging economies, the resources that are coming from Brazil, from Turkey, from India, from China, and making sure that those investments actually drive inclusive, sustainable growth, lift people out of poverty, create real jobs for people. No, we have leaders who are still stuck in the aid mentality and want to head to DC or London to ask for aid, but who are not smart and sophisticated enough to harness and plan for and use resources from the South. There are more resources in the South now than flowing from North to South. But I see the engagement that our African governments have with the emerging economies as not strategic and as not pro-jobs, pro the environment, pro our people. I see again a capture of that resource by a political elite. So I think there is a need for more competent leadership. The earlier point that I made, that we still have, maybe I might call them Cold War type of leadership. A leadership that wants to go to depend on aid rather than a leadership that engages with new sources of financing that is not based on an aid model. But the other point, I know we are running out of time, is on capitalism. My sister, you made an important point there. I think that the kind of capitalism we have today isn't even the capitalism we had 30 years ago. We have a capitalist system that has reached really a peak, and a terrible peak at that, where it is quite an unsustainable model. Why do I say that? To give you an example, in 1970, in this country, only about 10% of profits went directly to shareholders. The rest of the profits in businesses were plowed back into the business, making workers earn more, building the business further, and so on. Today, that fraction is 70% goes to shareholders. Shareholders want to make money every couple of months. CEOs are under pressure, die of high blood pressure because they must turn profits to their shareholders. So we have a form of shareholder capitalism that's pumping value out to shareholders and not benefiting all the other people who are part of the business, the workers, the suppliers, the consumers, the environment. All that gets very little out of business, everything going to shareholders. That's what's wrong with the economy. At the center of a rigged economy is a business model that is unsustainable. So we have an extreme form of capitalism that we must change. And it starts with governments deciding that growth, progress must be measured differently. They must not pursue just growth for the growth figure, but must pursue progress that benefits everybody and that protects our environment. And then business models must now return to a business model that benefits everyone who is contributing. Even me, the consumer, I should benefit, and the worker, and the woman who gets a wage that is lower than even a man's wage. So there's so much to reshape in the business model for us to have a growth that is benefiting everybody. And lastly, the thing about Africa and its past. I've found it always so interesting when we talk about our past, we Africans, when we are alone. When we talk about it, there are some who like to talk about the glorious past before other continents interfered in our continent. When I ask them about, but we only had kings, women had no voice, they say, no, it was okay, it was good. It wasn't all good. Then you have those who talk about colonialism and who have difficulty to talk about independence and the challenges and the failures. But for me, what I find most empowering is that common history, that Africa for 400 years went through slavery, and for 100 years, colonialism, 500 years of domination. And we are here today with independent countries. We survived. There are other continents where the indigenous people were wiped out. So for me, that shared history, and that answers your question when you say Africa is diverse. Yes, we are diverse. We're many countries, but we have that common history, and it always tells us that we also have a common future. And that's powerful. So we talk about the region, we don't mean that there is no diversity. There is a lot of diversity there, but there's also a lot that binds us, both good and bad.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I could think of a dozen other questions and points that were on the list. I'm sure so could you. But tonight was one way of thinking about African futures. And just to reassure you, the plural is very much acknowledging that there is no singular future, no singular past. And yet there are things that do identify or allow people to identify with the concept of a continent or a history that has brought strands together. And I think to both of you, I'd like to thank you for having accepted the invitation to provide a slightly more unusual framework to think about African futures, to share both your not only deep but extremely meaningful insights and the way that you are thinking, and through you also some of those voices on the continent that are thinking about the future have spoken to us tonight. Thank you all for being here. I would just like to make a couple of announcements. We have tomorrow International Women's Day, and here in Oxford we will host at the Oxford Martin School a gender equality in Oxford. How far have we come? Perhaps some analogous discussions on what we also touched on this evening. From 5:30 tomorrow. Then another focus on Africa's health and transition, led by a lecturer, Professor Kevin Marsh, who is the Professor of Tropical Medicine at the University of Oxford, and also half of his time spent as Senior Advisor at the African Academy of Sciences in Nairobi. And that will be on the 9th of March at 5 o'clock, and then on the 10th of March, 4 o'clock here at the Oxford Martin School, Climate Change Morphing into an Existential Problem. This is a lecture later this week held by Professor Ramanathan, Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric and Climate Sciences at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, and one of the lead voices and scientists on the short-lived climate pollutants, the atmospheric brown cloud, and the relationship to climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank once again our wonderful panelists, and may your voices and vision continue to inspire us. Thank you.